Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. We are still in search of America, where it is, what it is. We've looked all over the place recently on the show. We've looked in suburbia, where we found the unraveling of the American dream, although other people believe that maybe in suburbia there's some revolutionary potential, at least according to one recent guest, Matt Hearn. We've looked in a place called Exurbia with another author, David Mascioccia, but we haven't really looked in a particular place. One place that I'd never heard of before, but I've recently read about, a place right in the middle of the country, a place called Branson, Missouri, is a subject of a very intriguing essay in this month's Harper's magazine, The Branson Pilgrim. It's by Rafil Kroll-Zaidi, and Rafil is joining us from New York City, another American city. Rafil, how would you compare New York City, where you live, and Branson, Missouri, where over the last 10 years you've spent a lot of time?
I suppose both are the object of various dreams and fantasies that people have, but New York is known the world over, whereas Branson is something of an inside pilgrimage. It's an in-group marker, and this is one of the things that intrigued me about it the most, is that when I bring up the place, many people don't know about it, and over the years I learned that there was one question I could ask Americans that was often predictive of whether or not they knew about it, and that was, do both of your parents have university degrees? And if the interlocutor said yes, then it was almost entirely determinative, incredibly rare unless someone had grown up in the region. For someone with two university graduate parents to have heard of this place. Its audience for many years was almost entirely elderly, white, evangelical, and working class. And that started to change a bit in recent years, but it's still very much a byword for that kind of culture. And not just for that kind of culture, but for people within that culture who make a pilgrimage there, I suppose, in a way that is very backward looking. There was a famous 60-minute segment on Branson in the early 1990s that exposed it to a slightly wider audience than that group who were already going there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if most of our audience will be familiar. So the question, of course, Rafil, is why Branson for you? You've been going there for the last 10 years. What is it about this place that intrigued you so much? This is a long essay. It's, 5 or 10,000 words. It's obviously a place that you've given a great deal of thought, both as a place and I guess as a symbol of America.
I regret to inform you that it is in fact 13,000 words, to the delight and horror of audiences.
Well, I read the whole thing, and it didn't seem like 13,000, which is a compliment. It's a nicely written piece, but it's a significantly researched and thought out piece. I think it's the longest piece in this issue of Harper's.
Yes, by a substantial margin. It is a place that, if you have a background that's more like mine, fancy schools, sort of international upbringing, would be very unusual to encounter. And I didn't know anything about it except a very, very slight hint that it was a stage entertainment town for people who couldn't cut it in Vegas or had enjoyed successful careers earlier, but then decided to retire here to do a sort of a country western oriented performance, or in fact, maybe just came up in that place. And so I knew a little bit about this form of stage entertainment, which is shifted a little toward a hillbilly emphasis in terms of how they present themselves to their audience. But I had no reason to go there and no real interest in the place until someone wrote to me out of the blue who lived there about something unrelated, actually complaining about something I'd written.
And his name was Stephen.
His name was Stephen, and I removed his surname from the piece because he's a private citizen. He was, and I suppose still is, an aspiring writer, but I didn't want this to be the top Google hit for him for the rest of his life. And he challenged me to a fight about grammar in something I'd written, and I started reading his work. He really disliked the town of Branson. He disliked this hokey Americana that it stood for, all of these country variety shows, the played up hillbilly shtick, the has-beens of yesteryear television, the patriotism. He wanted to be more engaged with literary culture, coastal liberal culture, and I guess what says that more than having a fight online about grammar?
So let's get this straight. Not straight, Rafil. You talk about yourself as someone who went to fancy schools with an international background. Which schools, and what's your international background?
I went to a private school in Texas and to Princeton University, and I was born in India to an American mother and an Indian father, but I was never an Indian citizen. So I'm sort of from abroad, but I did not have the immigrant experience. I'm a faculty brat, and that's my world, the child of two professors.
So your world is of privilege for one kind or another, intellectual, probably economic, a graduate of Princeton. You were working at Harper's Magazine. You get this letter or email out the blue from someone called Stephen, who is calling you up about your grammar. What's Stephen's relationship with Branson? Does he live there, or he just visits it all the time?
He lives there. He wasn't born there, but he's actually from the north. But his parents, when he was still, I think, late single digits, moved to the south and still live there, and much of his family is still there in the region in and around Branson. So he had started a family there. He worked there at the time and really didn't like the place, but he was putting himself through university while working at the Olive Garden. He couldn't leave this place, but he really bridled against it. And that was one of the things that really interested me in the town is what could make someone dislike it so much, who is young, who had intellectual aspirations. What was this thing that he was rejecting?
And in a sense, then, he, or perhaps your essay, is a reverse of the hillbilly elegies, is it?
Maybe a little bit. I find it hard to think of J.D. Vance as he used to be. So that's all become tainted. But that's an interesting point. I hadn't at all thought of it that way.
Although your piece, I think, is, you read these pieces on a small town like Branson, and you would have either expected hillbilly elegy, this sort of nostalgic embrace of Americana, or a completely coastal rejection. And you're very careful to do neither. Is that fair?
I wanted to straddle those worlds. So yes, that's a very deliberate thing, and I'm glad that it came off as successful. I write early on in the piece about this quiz that is taken out from a Charles Murray book about the white working class, and was made available on PBS. And I know Murray is a controversial figure for the bell curve. This is not a particularly controversial book. And in that quiz, there's a question, which is, does Branson mean to you Sir Richard Branson, or does it mean Branson, Missouri? And if you say Branson, Missouri, then you get an extra question that asks, have you ever been to Branson? And if you answer that, it gives you just an absurd number of points. And I wanted to bridge those worlds of people who have that first association with Branson meaning Virgin Airlines, Virgin Records, and this sort of kind of diffuse Atlanticism and modernity. And on the other hand, people for whom it means this place that's very special to a certain form of American identity. And I wouldn't want to condescend to either group. So I would hope that it would be interesting even to someone who knows the place, but that it also gives a sort of fair and affectionate portrait to someone who'd never heard of it and who's never set foot outside the Upper West Side or something like that.
So you wrote this 13,000 word piece. You've been going there, what, for 10 years?
It was a 10-year span. The first visit when I mean, it's sort of insane to think of myself at this stage in my life. I didn't have a contract. I didn't have an idea of what I was doing in 2012. I simply flew down there to meet Stephen, to talk to him, to find out a bit more about who he was, and to check out the town. And still without any particular idea in mind for what this would become, I went back during the Christmas season in 2014, and then twice in 2021, by which point the town had really started to change from those first two visits.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me, having read the piece, was it seemed from your piece that it was actually a reasonably large place, but from Wikipedia it suggests that the population is only 12,000. It's not even a town. So you build it up. I mean, you have to if you're going to write 13,000 words about it. But this is not a big place, Rafil, is it?
It's a big place culturally. I think there are, as you just showed in the Wikipedia entry, it's barely over 10,000 people, but annual visitorship is somewhere around 10 million at this point. So it has a lot of throughput. Yeah. And there are still the older, more conservative, and overwhelmingly sort of Anglo-Saxon Americans who come there from as far away as Alaska, Florida, for whom the place offers something special. These variety shows, the mix of country music, Christianity, a particular sense of humor, for whom it's this big kind of a draw. And then there's a much newer crowd who are younger, more diverse, often a little poorer of means, for whom it's just another regional entertainment center, as you might have in Florida. So they're not coming there from 6 states away. They're coming there from within about 300 or 350 miles because it's the best thing on offer.
You mentioned Las Vegas. How would you distinguish it from Las Vegas?
The stars are of a dimmer sort, perhaps, and there's no gambling. That would not fit with the evangelical Christian spirit. That's a big part of the town. Although in the 1990s, in the late 80s, the place really started blowing up, and there was a sort of chain reaction of entertainers bringing in other entertainers. So Willie Nelson wound up there. Wayne Newton wound up there. Yakov Smirnoff, whose career had collapsed with the end of the Soviet Union, the famous In Russia and America inversion joke comedian, he wound up.
Yeah, and you make him central in. I have to admit I hadn't heard of him, but he's an intriguing figure. You write a great deal about him in the essay.
And he had played Vegas and other big places, but there are people for whom Vegas would be a struggle. And in the 90s, a few of them came to Branson because Andy Williams had set up there. He was still a big star at that point. And it seemed almost like a license to print money to set up there. The theaters were full. You could sort of set up shop in a way that you could really shape and determine. So it was a bit more like Vegas back then, where there were these household names. But then that became a bit of a bubble. The bubble burst in the late 1990s. There were just too many of these stage and variety acts and recording stars and TV stars.
I mean, you don't make the place sound sad, but some people will be listening to this and thinking, this sounds a pretty sad place. Has-beens, people who can't even make it, entertainers who can't make it in Las Vegas end up there. It attracts a very American crowd, a lower middle class crowd, presumably in political terms, and we'll talk about politics later, but certainly probably more tending towards Trump than Biden. Is there an element of sadness here, or is that the wrong word?
The piece is generally shot through with some sadness, but I don't think it's because the place is in any sense contemptible or pathetic or second rate. It was such a confectionery assemblage of things that a certain kind of person really loved, and that faith and that enthusiasm made it something that was not sad, that was actually kind of moving. I think one thing that makes me a bit sad is just that world is being replaced. It doesn't make economic sense anymore, and it hasn't for 20 years, to count on this very elderly crowd who are set on stage entertainment. Even people in their 40s and 50s by now, by the time that they become 65 or 70, the traditional Branson age, they're not going to be as into an Elvis impersonator act, or rather tribute artist, to be non-insulting, as a 65 or 70-year-old today, or certainly 20 years ago. So I think there is the reason that people visit there is a sort of elegiac to begin with, and the town has become its own elegy because that part of it is dying, and it's becoming replaced by younger people who are there with their children for roller coasters and theme parks and so on.
We're speaking with Rafil Kroll-Zaidi, who has a 13,000-word piece in Harper's. That's why Harper's is such a great magazine. They publish good stuff by smart writers like Rafil, as does our own particular sponsor, Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics that also publishes stuff that is longer, more complicated, and more sophisticated than you normally read. You're going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Rafil Kroll-Zaidi to talk more about the meaning of his piece, and particularly in America, which seems increasingly divided between its coast and its interior. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Rafil Kroll-Zaidi, the author of a very interesting essay in this month's issue of Harper's, The Branson Pilgrim, a 13,000-word account of his infatuation, if that's the right word, with a place called Branson, right in the middle of the country in Missouri, a small town, but leaving a large footprint, at least in the mind of Rafil. Rafil, the politics, of course, comes to mind. In an America divided between rural and urban centers, between its coast and its interior, what did you learn as someone from New York City, a Princeton graduate, a guy who works on the editorial team at Harper's? What did you learn about this breakdown of, or supposed breakdown of, civility and conversation in America from all this time you spent in Branson?
I didn't find anything like that there. I do try to get out to rural America and listen to people, and so I'm not as surprised by certain tendencies that I know the commentariat and the chattering classes, whatever cliche you want to apply to them, seem to have about, say, rural conservatives. I grew up in Austin, Texas, which is a university town, but I realized in retrospect that a number of my friends from my earlier school days were from what you'd call real redneck families, lived far outside town, and I'm not unexposed to the kinds of people either the locals are or the visitors. The locals are saltier, and some of them are rednecks, that is, the ones who don't work in the hospitality industry. But the visitors there are all very upright. The older visitors, I should say, the classic Branson visitors who still go there, are all, they tend to be Reagan conservatives. So there is an a continuing, almost excessive love of immigrants, asterisk, as long as they are sort of the legally entering bootstrapping kind. And of course, if you get out and listen to people, you're not surprised that there are many Hispanic and Asian American conservatives out there who are immigrants and who've succeeded through various entrepreneurial means and tend a bit libertarian or something like that. So between those kinds of slightly older conservatives, I mean, many of whom are Trump voters now anyway, but let's call them Reagan conservatives, and immigrants, there's a sort of love affair. And in fact, those kinds of immigrants with that kind of ideology have done quite well in Branson, making that ideology part of their self-presentation, part of their performances. Yakov Smirnov, whom we talked about earlier, is one of them, from out of the obscurity of Soviet Russia to tremendous wealth and fame in the United States, and then to a lesser sort of stable fame in Branson.
You write also in the piece quite a lot about race and identity. You note that most of the people there are white, but you also note, you had conversations with people of different skins. You're self-evidently, at least for people watching, you're not a white guy. You're of mixed race, certainly darker than the conventional American. What did you learn about race, or the mythology of race, and its supposed centrality in the American narrative from the time in Branson?
I was a little bit caught out by the issue of race. I found it so conspicuous during my first visit there in 2012 that I saw not a single black person out of maybe 12,000, 10,000 people I saw in the course of a week. It was really, really sort of empty of that kind of thing. And there was one moment where I was particularly conscious that I was outside the norm, which was when a train conductor decided to search my bag, not for drugs as a policeman might, but for contraband snacks, which I later found were not even...
What's a contraband snack?
I thought since it was a dinner, the train was one of those ancient trains they've converted to a sort of short track tourist affair. And I thought since it had a dinner car, one mustn't bring one's own food on, even if one is not in the dining car.
But they would have confiscated a packet of peanuts?
Yeah, well, or searched me for one. But then I found out from a different conductor's conversation with a couple on the train, I should note, a white woman and a Hispanic Navy veteran, who politely asked whether in future they might bring some snacks on, that it was absolutely no problem. So that was a slightly weird moment. But by 2021, the sort of sense of this place, and one of the performers there very explicitly said that he figures black people didn't used to be tempted to come there, even for the sort of let's call it non-ideological, sort of culturally minimal attractions like bumper cars and mini golf and all of these other things, because the town had this reputation as a place that was unfriendly, or at least overwhelmingly white. By the time I was there in 2021, this was no longer the case. There were much more diverse crowds everywhere, and I was able to notice particularly a large number of Black Americans, younger people.
Yeah, you know, I'm looking through the piece now. You know that there is a KKK connection. We did a show earlier this week with a young man whose father was a Grand Wizard and has written a book rejecting all the ideologies.
Must be Derek Black.
Yes, Derek Black.
Of course, yes.
What is the connection between Branson and the Klan?
There's certainly geographic proximity there. The Klan's notional national headquarters are outside of Harrison, Arkansas, which is just across the border. And there is some connection between a shop in town that sells a lot of Confederate regalia and apparently the sort of the Klan scene over in Harrison. So Harrison is not not a town that you want to hold up as a sort of hotbed of open-mindedness or a great place to raise your children, unless you're perhaps from a family like Derek Black's was. But the town itself exhibits this, I would say, just in the sense that the sort of the outlying rural area is, reflects that to some degree, reflects that, let's say, somewhat racist culture to more than some other place would. And so there was an interesting thing where I never was exposed to any of this the first few times I visited, but by 2021, I suspect, just because there were so many more minorities around, once I was with 2 or more other darker people, we would tend to get catcalled. When I was by myself, it wasn't an issue.
What do you mean catcall?
Oh, just people shouting Trump or other things, and then not me, but to some other people I was with, getting called racial epithets. And this was very clearly not the people who come to that town who are unfailingly polite, who hear my very American accent and assume I'm an immigrant who just speaks amazing English and are only too charmed to talk to me. That's not what people come there to do. They come there to be a part of an America, I think, that embraces people like me, or whatever they assume that I am. But I think those are locals, and who very pointedly do not work in the hospitality industry, which is a very hospitable scene above all else.
Rafil, I don't want to get into Trump too much. He's spoken on this show and other shows about him, but if you like, a sort of decline of a certain kind of entertainment economy, which is undermining Branson. Is the alternative to the entertainment presented in Branson the kind of thing that Trump is doing, this 24/7 reality television shtick that doesn't go away, and you don't need to go all the way to Branson to be entertained?
I don't know that it's an alternative. It's not a tidy alternative, but I know what you mean. And I think what Trump does, and the media ecosystem that he's a part of, feeds much more into what is not necessarily replacing Branson for people 65 and older who like Trump, but is certainly for younger people displacing the need to be somewhere to see something live and in person. Many more people enjoy Trump on social media than would bother to go to a rally that's 100 miles away to see him. That's going to be a really hardcore group. And the idea of going somewhere to express a political or emotional or cultural affiliation, to spend money and time doing that, is something that's probably being eaten away very rapidly. So I think that that in that sense, Trump is almost an alternative to himself. I think that he's sort of too good for TV to make the live thing worth it to go very far out of your way. And Branson is even if it's not appealing to exactly the same cultural crowd, there are Democrats who go there, probably not coastal liberals, but Midwestern liberals by all means. People from Utah and Texas and North Carolina I've met there who made it clear that that's not the politics that they're a part of, who go there. And I think for very, very broadly, making that trip to experience culture, to experience some sense of affiliation, and to be a part of pressing the warm flesh all around you, and to see someone live in the flesh on stage, to see an imitation of an imitation in the cases of many of the Elvis or Beatles tribute artists, something like that. That's going away, and I don't know that there's anything to replace it, or rather that there's an equivalent that can replace it, that's live, that's not just 24 hours a day media cycle on your phone, being constantly available and served up in 70-second doses.
Speaking of replacing things, one of the things I liked about the piece were the photos, and they're all taken by you. You clearly carry your camera around. In the old days, when magazines like Harper's had more money, and no doubt you would have had a professional photographer with you. Is there a kind of a connection, a symmetry perhaps between the fate of Branson and the fate of traditional media, magazines, high-end magazines like Harper's, and indeed high-end writers like you?
Very pointed question. I will say, for one thing, that because I have a background in, I suppose, what you would call art photography, I beat out any separate photographer being sent there to cover this. So it was, I hope, at least partly on the basis of merit and not convenience. And I did get paid on a separate basis for that.
Oh, good.
Which is itself, as you point out, it's a vanishing thing. And I think that you're absolutely right. There's a sort of a meta elegy going on, writing about a vanishing culture of, let's call it, some higher degree of physicality and tolerance for a broad spectrum of offerings. This is not a one author Substack. Harper's is, it brings a variety of writers together, and you hope that when you go there, as it were, when you sign up for a subscription or you pick up an issue of the magazine, that you're getting a selection of things that are clustered around an affiliation, and that is something that's increasingly hard to sell people. Branson, as you have teed me up to point out, is surely very similar. You go there because there's a cluster of things that all entertain or interest in the same way, and you can take some of them and leave others. And maybe it's because of the way that I was brought up in sort of one of the last bastions of legacy media that I think it's particularly sad to see a place like Branson, for all its quirks and deficiencies and flaws and positive offerings, start to fade in the way that a lot of magazines and journals have.
Do you think more photographers, writers, artists, recording artists even, in New York City or San Francisco, where I am, should they get out more? Should they go to places like, I mean, Branson's a one-off, but should they go to Missouri? Should they go to Arizona? Should they go to Texas?
I think there's a strange kind of journalism that tends to really annoy particularly progressive readers, which is sort of talking to the canonical Trump voter in the cafe somewhere in the middle of the country. And I understand why that's annoying, and I also understand what deficiencies in cultural reporting that's meant to address. I think it would actually help a lot of creative people, particularly creative people in the media, to spend time in these places when they're not on assignment. I found that to be one of the most rewarding things I've experienced in recent years, is to be in rural America and to have lots of interactions with people, with the local culture. If there is sort of culture on offer, as there is in Branson, not every place has culture qua culture, where you can buy a ticket to a museum or go to a theater and see a show. And to just have that in a kind of not even particularly deliberate way infiltrate your understanding of other people. And once you've done that, you find it much closer to home. I for various reasons, wind up talking to QAnoners and other highly conspiracy-minded people with extremely conservative politics who live in Brooklyn and Queens, and it's never to my detriment to understand how more people think. And when I am going somewhere to report a story, or I'm interested in a topic and I want to write about it, even if it's not directly poised on politics, very little that I work on is. I'm more interested in way small towns are deformed by money, and the way that you see a larger part of America in very peculiar and small places, that's informed by all of that background work. So I would say if you're driving cross country, if you're driving from LA to Florida or something like that, then don't just stop in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Don't do the hippie trail of that and Marfa and Austin. Stop in some places you might think are terrible, and be charmed by a place like Branson or Pigeon Forge, which is a sort of a less exciting version of a place like Branson.
Finally, Rafil, let's end where we began with America. You're not someone who I think is very keen on simple summaries, but there are two schools of thought about the future of America. One very pessimistic, one which is a little bit more hopeful. What did your experience in Branson over these last few years, what did it teach you about the future of America? Should we be hopeful? Can America, which has had a history of remarkable invention and reinvention, can it continue to reinvent itself? I mean, even, I guess Branson is not a place, in a way, it's a place that has invented and reinvented itself. It's a very unusual place. Maybe it has a future, but should we be a little bit more optimistic about the future of America? Particularly when some people, and we've done shows on this, are warning of civil war.
Well, this might be a roundabout answer, but I suppose I'm reminded first of something you said in your interview with Adam Hochschild, that Tocqueville remains the gold standard for thinking and talking about America. And in a quiet kind of way, I mention him only once in the piece, but he's in a way
Tocqueville, not Adam.
Yes. Although all due respect to Adam, but
and his wife, of course, is the master or the mistress of the other America.
Yes.
Arlie Hochschild. But go on, sorry.
Yes, so thinking of democracy in America, so the sort of explicit precedents that I gesture toward, the subheadline is chock full of all these sort of ridiculous grab bag things that I encounter in Branson, which is a nod to David Foster Wallace's classic Harper's piece about the Iowa State Fair. But the person I would like to think that I'm continuing in the tradition of it is Tocqueville. That's not something that occurred to me until after I was writing the piece. So Tocqueville with on-the-record interviews rather than pure, much more general summary and gesticulation and abstraction. And the people that I talk to informing my more Tocquevillian generalizations and abstraction about nostalgia and conservatism and American identity and the process of aging as an individual, the process of aging as a culture. Some of them were people deeply unlike me with whom I would not affiliate in everyday life. The people who are the subjects of the sort of mini profiles, Yakov Smirnoff, Clay Cooper, who's a country musician who has one of the family variety shows there, Jerry Presley, a cousin to Elvis, who is an Elvis tribute artist himself, and several other people. And I am always optimistic when I meet and talk to individual Americans with patience and respect, even those who are of vastly different mindsets and backgrounds from mine. I'm always optimistic about Americans, and I love Americans. I love going to boring places and seeking out people who ought to be boring in some sense, not the profile subjects, but to sort of challenge myself to find the interesting, if not the good. So Americans individually give me hope, and I enjoy talking with them and find sources of common understanding and respect in many unlikely instances when I've been out reporting or not reporting in the rural depths of the country here and there. I don't know if that optimism translates to a vision of America as a whole, because among other things, we don't have a parliamentary system. We have this two-party system. And I think that the sort of the nuance and the diversity of the individual Americans that I talk to does not have a great set of outlets in the model of corporate and financial capitalism that the United States runs on, or in the political representation that we are set up for. I'll just make a very brief gesture to a piece I'm working on now that's set in New York, very much about New York, and it's about local government and governance. Showed me that if you have a very, very small place and can control it, whether it's New York City Council and the Department of Environmental Protection in New York, where you know your friends, you know your enemies, and you can all sit in a room, you can fit everybody who cares about an issue in a room to talk about it. That's something that, you know, you can put those individual hopeful Americans in one place and get something out of it on that level. In Branson, maybe you can do it through the board of aldermen, of whom Clay Cooper, the musician I just mentioned, is a member. But on the level of a country as vast as this, when we're trying to fit into these 1 million multifariously shaped pegs, or 330 million multifariously shaped pegs into very few holes, and with the particular economic systems that we have in play, having listened to many episodes of your podcast over the last year, I know the pessimism you're speaking of, and I would say that unfortunately, because the individual doesn't translate well to the collective, and I end my long-winded answer here, I side more with the pessimists you've been talking